The More of Us podcast features real, uncut conversations about life, pastoral ministry, and walking with Jesus. All guests are pastors in the Charis Fellowship, bound by our common commitment to biblical truth, relationship, and mission. We trust as you hear more of us, you'll see Christ among us. I'm going to wait for Michael to stop eating his chips. I'm just joking. Hey, Michael, Lockstampfor, it's great to have you here with me and Trent today on the More of Us podcast. Michael and I met at the Access Conference 2 years ago when Grace College hosted it. Michael reached out to me afterwards and said, I want to become your best friend. And I said, or maybe he said, we are best friends. And then I said, well, I'm going to follow up and you'll be on the podcast. So here we are a couple years later. You've been at the Ocala Neighborhood Church for 4 years in the lead role. You got a large family with 6 kids, your wife, Jess. I know you have some roots here at Grace. And Trent Lambert and I want to say hello and thanks for being on the podcast with us.
Well, hello, Tim, my best friend.
Hello.
Don't tell Eric Miller because he also is another person. I said, hey, we're best friends now.
Apparently that's your pickup line, and I fell for it. I fell for it totally. Hey, that's all right. Can you help me with one thing? How do you pronounce your last name, best friend?
Well, it's not actually verbalized. It's the name that's not spoken.
Oh.
It's just there for intimidation factor.
This is like a Harry Potter reference almost. Okay.
Yeah, I say Lockstampfor.
Okay, that's what it looks like in print. Lockstampfor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to spell it. My pop, when he got back from World War II, was like, hey, I'm going to change the spelling and look as American as possible because I'm not a fan of Germans anymore. So.
Okay.
Michael, welcome to the program. And I think I'm just going to stick with Michael.
Yeah, let's do that. I was looking at your website too, and I know that you were part of the redesign for your network of churches down there. Maybe you'll get into that later, but it does say that you're into horticulture. So can you tell me about that?
Sure. It started with cutting grass for a hospital. My dad worked at the last locally owned independent hospital in Virginia, and he was a finance guy, and I needed a job for the summer before we got married. So I got put on a groundskeeping team with a guy who was 80. And so when the pond is that small, you really look like a superstar if you can mow faster than like 8 hours. So when I came to Florida, we moved into the area, didn't know anybody here other than Pastor Todd. We were living in his house and was just trying to find something and applying everywhere we could. I guess long story short, ended up working for a really wealthy guy downtown who had basically leveled his property and built a botanical garden on his house. And I managed to get a job taking care of that property with my only qualification was that I had mowed grass at a hospital for the summer. And they gave me glowing reviews because I was faster than the guy who was 80 years old. So
I got to ask you a question in your field there. Are you a zero-turn guy?
I'm looking at one right now. Yeah, we've got a zero turn.
Now, have you seen the ones where you stand up and do that?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I've used those before.
Why would you want to do that? That's my question. If you're mowing your yard and you have the option to sit down, why would you want to stand up? Tell me how that's better.
Well, here's a cultural difference between Indiana and Florida I've discovered. Floridians don't mow their lawn. They have somebody else do it. And Indiana folks take real good pride in their straight lines and their crisscross hatch pattern. And in Florida, they're just like, oh, just keep it from growing over my house. Somebody else will hack this thing down.
We had an older guy at our church who mowed the lawn for years, and I would look out the window and see him sleeping. And I thought he could benefit from a stand-up mower because if he fell asleep, he'd wake up real fast.
Keep him moving for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael, again, it's so great to be with you today. And we're here to share your story, your church story with a lot of people in the Charis Fellowship. And one of the things that's very important to Tim and I is family. It seems like Tim and I always run into each other. We're at a sporting event with our kids or working out at the Y or something to that effect. But tell us just a little bit about your family.
Our family really kind of started back in middle school. Jesse and I started dating when I was in the 8th grade. And so we dated for 7 years and then decided we might as well just get married after I finished college. And I never really had a plan to have a huge family. Jesse's one of 4 and I have one sister. And like, we just didn't really think about it. Our plan was to go to school and she would get a job and support me while I did the Lord's work going to seminary, and got out to Indiana to do that. And really quickly, neither one of us could find a job and we had to figure something out. And then she got pregnant. And so we're like, well, I guess I better go to work. So I went to work and, we just never stopped having kids. 6 later, we've got the crew, and it's just, for us, has always been if children are from the Lord and this is how he's chosen to bless us, where do we take the right to say, like, no, this is not the kind of blessing I want. And it's been real talk, it's been a ongoing challenge in our faith of how do we surrender this to the Lord, and a process to work through as a married couple, how to navigate that faith issue together, when it seems like for a while there we took different sides of how to approach it. So,
what are the ages of your kids?
Our youngest is 4 and our oldest is 12. So we've got 6 within like 10 years or something like that.
So you are quite busy. The next question I was going to ask you is, what are your hobbies? You don't have any hobbies.
Yeah, my hobbies are sleeping.
Yeah.
There's nothing else I'd rather do than be asleep.
Well, do you play basketball? Do you shoot hoops? Do you hunt? What do you like to do?
I have kept an aquarium off and on, with moderate success, freshwater aquarium, nothing super fancy. But there's not, I played music for a while, but that's, at the time I was a worship leader. And so that felt like it was also work. And so, if I get real antsy, I'll go for a run. And that'll burn off some of that extra mental anguish. And if now that I don't do landscaping so much anymore, if I've got some hours on a Saturday, then I'll just go pits out in the side yard and pull some weeds and trim up plants and stuff like that. That's really refreshing to me.
I do remember a conversation we had last year, maybe it was earlier this year. I think actually we went to a restaurant and you were telling me about reading fiction too, and I think you were reading through a fantasy series at the time. So you do occasionally get to read some too. I don't know if that's a hobby or a discipline, but that's probably a little part of you.
I don't know that I'd call it a hobby as much. I've discovered there's because I was doing landscaping at this guy's property, like I really had 40 hours a week to listen to audiobooks and podcasts. And so I spent 4 years, 40 hours a week, always something in my ears. And I got to listen to a lot of different kinds of things. And one of the things I stumbled across was a podcast called the Read Aloud Revival, which is the folks or homeschool folks, which is not my crew a lot. But one of the things that they said is like, hey, if you sit down with a good book, a good story, and you just sit on the couch and start reading it out loud, it doesn't matter what your kids are doing, they will kind of gravitate to that story. And I was like, no way that this works. And I just started doing it. And so bedtime, I'd just sit on the couch and start reading a book out loud. And the ones who were interested would gravitate close, but everybody else would chill out. And I was like, this is really useful. I'm going to keep doing this.
I like that.
So it's a survival mechanism, but we've chewed up some pretty good stories too.
That's great. It also feeds into your hobby, which is sleeping. So it prepares everyone for bedtime. It's a win-win. Tell us about one pet peeve of yours, or maybe a personality quirk that you have.
I mean, probably personality quirk is the thing that I think most people have difficulty wrapping their heads around. Is like my default emotion is sadness.
Huh.
And people get really freaked out by that. And they think like I'm always doom and gloom. And it's not that I actually feel doom and gloom. It's just like that's my neutral mode. And so my dad was a super pessimist. I come by that honest. But yeah, so probably personality quirk is I by default I'm sad, but that doesn't mean that I hate everybody. It just means I'm pretty mellow. Trying to think of, I feel like Abraham Lincoln. There was a biography about him here recently, and they gave him a title of that kind of a thing, and I can't remember. Melancholic, maybe.
Okay.
A melancholic personality.
I know I was doing a little study on the 7 deadly sins, and when those were originally penned by Evagrius Ponticus, he actually had 8 deadly sins, and the one that we scrapped from the list is the deadly sin of sadness, believe it or not. So, well, I'm not saying it's going to kill you. I'm just saying, like, if you live in excessive sorrow, it can rob you of life and joy, and so it's one of those things to be aware of. But I like that you know that about yourself, and that it doesn't mean you hate everybody. You don't hate me.
Yeah. Well, most days. We also don't have to work together, so I can drop in and be a part of your life momentarily and then move on with life.
And Tuesdays are a good day, right?
Tuesdays are my meeting days, so
good days.
I'm geared up to talk to people.
Nice.
Hey, let's segue just a little bit here, and let's talk about some ministry, Michael. And I'm always fascinated and interested when I talk to pastors and ministry leaders. I kind of keep a little bit of a journal of just, how people have been called to ministry, how God has dealt with their personality to get their attention. Do you have a clear call to ministry? Do you have a story that you can articulate and tell us how God called you to the ministry you're at?
Yeah. I was thinking about this a lot, actually, the last couple of weeks, as we think about leadership development and how to really invite the next generation of pastors into the leadership role that God's prepared for them. Like, what kind of environment is it that people grow in that calling? And reflecting on my story and reflecting on other stories that I've heard recently, it seems like God, in His mercy, will use really unhealthy situations to call people to greater health. So I was at are we allowed to talk about other schools than Grace?
Be careful, Michael.
You are allowed. We give you permission.
Okay. Well, if it makes it better, I followed my girlfriend at the time to her Christian school of preference. I was at Liberty University wrestling through. I was a music major first, and just kind of going through the Christian education thing. And we went to campus church one Wednesday night, and the pastor was talking about how the local church is God's plan A for the world, and there isn't like a plan B. That like even as we go from this Christian university and serve maybe in nonprofits or other parachurch organizations, that like not to forsake the church, because that's what Jesus died for and is actively building. And so he just, as he closed, he said, let's just pray for our churches back home. And the church that I really began to be discipled in had gone through a bunch of crises and had really toxic leadership. And it was a Baptist church, and there were all these fights between the deacons and the pastor, and contingents and camps and different committees warring. And I remember being like, why the heck would I pray for this church? Like it's not good. And God's like, yeah, and if you don't step in, like if there isn't somebody who can see that, then it's never going to change. And so as close to the audible voice of God before that day and after that day, all he said to me was pastor. And I knew in that that the music thing that I was pursuing was really just self-worship. I wanted to be a rock star. And he had equipped me to be a servant and to shepherd other people. And so if I was gonna lose my life, then I needed to lose it there, not to lose it in the pursuit of becoming a rock star. So that started the trajectory. I went the next morning to change my degree from music to biblical studies, because there's a pastoral degree, but I was like, I don't care what people say about being a pastor. I should probably figure out what the Bible has to say about it. And had 3 professors in that program who were head and shoulders better than anybody else in the whole college. And I was like, and they all had connections to Grace Theological Seminary. So I didn't know anything about the fellowship. I'd never even heard of it before, but I was like, I don't know where I got to go, but if these guys come out of there knowing their Bible like they do, I need to go there. And so that's how I ended up coming to the seminary, and a few more steps into coming into the fellowship as well.
I love that story. I love that there's a clear experiential part of it. You hear God calling you, but then there's this commitment to biblical truth. And that's something that in the Charis Fellowship we really value, is biblical truth, and then living out this biblical mission. So it's great to see that God formed you that way, not the part of the church having lots of drama in it. That's a sad part. I do know that Ocala is not the first church that you've had a leadership role in, so I would be curious for you to share a little bit more. Okay, so you've had this call, you've gone to study in seminary, you've told us a little bit about how you then had to go to work because you started having kids. So what's the rest of your pastoral leadership journey look like?
Well, just to follow up, the church I grew up in ended up closing maybe 10 years after I prayed that prayer. And they ended up entrusting their facilities to a church plant in that area. So they're in that building now is a life-giving church, but it also involved the death of something that was really unhealthy. And so I'm confident that no matter what direction God leads, like, his desire is to bring life, and he sometimes apparently will do that even through death. So I agree with you that the value is biblical truth. I applied to the Grace Seminary not knowing anything about the fellowship, and I was like, I should probably figure out what this fellowship at Grace Brethren Churches is about, and did just a cursory reading of recent history and thought, man, these guys split over really silly things. Like, I don't think this is something I want to do. And called up the registrar. I said, hey, I want to take my application out. Like, I don't want to be a part of this fellowship thing. And he was like, well, you can come to the seminary and learn the Bible without being part of the fellowship. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. As long as nobody asks me to be part of the fellowship, I'll be good. And so we packed up. We got married in July and moved to Indiana in August. Found out we were pregnant in September, and got our first jobs in October. So it was hairy there for a minute. And I got a job working at Lifeline Youth and Family Services, which is there in Pierceton, right down the road. And started going to First Baptist Church there in Warsaw, and started leading music for them, because that was the only thing I really knew how to do as far as ministry-wise went. And that role grew from just being super part-time, like $20 a week worship leader, to leading their student ministry and their worship department as well for a season. And there's a fella in seminary named Tom McQueen, who I think you know, Tim.
I do know Todd, yeah.
So he came to the seminary pursuing a call into chaplaincy, and then after he had sold everything and moved out there, the Army changed their restrictions. So he got a call to God to go to ministry, and then got to go do that, and they changed everything that he was going to do. So we were friends because he forced me to be friends. I was not very social. I don't like doing networking stuff. So I would walk to class, and I realized that these seminary guys, if I wore a denim jacket and a hoodie and kept my hood on and looked really mean, like nobody would talk to me.
Huh.
But Todd had worked in a prison for 13 years, and so he thought I was like a lollipop. He was not intimidated at all. And so he would just be like, hey, you're the one that's in church. You're the one who already has a church job. You're doing ministry. Like, you got to tell us what to do. And I was like, this is like, my perspective on it was like, I got a part-time job for $20 a week. And his perspective of it was, you have ministry. Like, you're doing ministry. You're doing the thing that we all came to train to do. And that was really strange. But he was always a cheerleader for me. And I don't remember what question I'm even answering at this point.
Well, you just telling us about your ministry journey. You went to seminary and then how, from there to Ocala.
Yeah. So Todd got hired by Matt Wheelock there, whom you've already spoken with, to come and do a residency in Sebring in order to be sent up to Ocala, which is about 2.5 hour difference, to revitalize that church. And so when Todd left the seminary, he said, hey, I'd really like for you to come with me. And I said, absolutely not. Like, things are going great at our church, and I've got a mentor here that I really care about. And so like, I'll do what I can to help you. I built a website for them early on. Anything I could do from a distance, I was willing to contribute, but we definitely were not going to move. And went into a really difficult season, probably the second hardest, like, spiritual season of my life, where we just were really disoriented by what was happening in the church. And it was real clear that the way for that church to go forward was for us to get out of the way. And so we started praying, and really our options were, we could go back to Virginia and I could work at the hospital and head up their facilities department, because they still thought I walked on water. Or we could follow Todd down to Florida and move where we have no relations at all and plant the church or revitalize the church. And it was a time where we really didn't feel like God would speak at all. So praying, fasting, seeking, and the line was dead. Like, there was nothing coming back. And so I don't remember, that was 6 months or so of really wrestling, and finally just saying, well, we came all this way. We didn't come this far to quit. So let's go see what God's got for us in Florida. And called Todd, because he had been posting homework for their core team on the website. So I called Todd to tell him to turn in our homework as a way to tell him that, we were going to join the team in Florida. And he didn't answer, so I left him a voicemail, call me back. And he calls me back sobbing. He had been on the phone with Ed Short, who was kind of coaching him at the time. And he said, Todd had told Ed, hey, I really would like Mike to come, but I really don't want to mess up his life, because he's got a new family, he's got a wife. Like, I don't want them to mess up their life coming to do this crazy thing in Florida with me. And Ed said, no, we're not going to pray like that. Like, if you think that God has put him in your life to come down and plant this church with you, then you need to pray that God would do that. And so let's stop right now and pray that God would send the Lockstampfors to Florida. Wow. I'm not supposed to cry, Tim. Okay, well, maybe I'll cry a little bit. So while I'm calling, yeah, it's true. It's true. So while I'm calling him to tell him that we're coming to Florida, he's praying that God would send us. And so those 6 months of silence and wondering where Jesus was, like, as soon as we committed, like, no, our way is to follow him even into the things that we don't understand. It's like, that's it, Mike. That's what I was waiting for. I knew you knew the right answer, but I was waiting for you to know it. You kept asking me for guidance when I had already given it. So stop asking for something new if you're not going to do what I already told you to do. And so just confirmation after confirmation that this was where we were supposed to be. The folks in Indiana are great, and we were there for 4 years. And after about 3 years, I thought, hey, maybe we can find a place to live here and we can do ministry here in Indiana. But we weren't in Ocala for more than a week before I was like, no, this is home. This is exactly where we're supposed to be. And this time, like it was right. And so, yeah, it was kind of a goofy thing.
Michael, listening to you share that story, I'm sure Tim can attest as well. We've all had those moments that it's gut-wrenching. God, where are you? Where are we supposed to be? And that moment that we just know that we know, and we have that peace of God that we are exactly where he wants us to be, it's so life-giving, so settling. And so I'm just presuming it was just like a burden lifted off your shoulders.
Yeah, well, in one sense as it was, in another sense, we got a confirmation that the thing that God was calling us to do was probably the hardest thing we'd ever do in our lives. So we walked into a church that needed revitalization, and we didn't know how to do that. And so I could write a book on all the ways not to like lead a church revitalization, because we messed it up real bad. And spent, a good 8 years really floundering. After that moment of like clarity, it was okay, now we're going to go and go into the grinder again. So I think that default sadness has been helpful, because the expectations real low.
Well, and on that note, let me ask you this. So we've learned some things from our past. You and your wife, you learned some things, and then you get to Ocala. And so what are some new skills, maybe some disciplines you had to develop for where you're at presently?
I needed Todd in ways that I never could have anticipated. His 13 years working in the Ohio State prison system were exactly what I needed, coming from, a toxic Baptist church where really all I wanted was for people to like me. I was a real people pleaser and non-confrontational. And working with Todd for 4 years, like I would spend 2 weeks working up the gumption to have like a confrontational conversation, and I'd have it. And then the next day would realize it didn't even register on Todd's radar. Like he didn't even notice that it was conflict. He just thought it was a talk. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? And he's like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you so sensitive? Like, it doesn't matter, whatever. So like I needed that. Where if I'd have stayed where I was serving in Indiana, like I would have just continued in those same things, but passive aggressive, people pleasing, all that kind of stuff. But working with Todd, I really had the opportunity to learn some thick skin. So I learned the thick skin from Todd, and I think God preserved a soft heart, not as soft as it was, but a soft heart through just continual failure. I don't know how to respond to that either. So I appreciate you guys' awkward silence.
I'm just thinking if there were other skills though, or disciplines that you developed. So yeah, confrontation, not being people pleasing. Were there other things? Because you didn't start in the lead role. You did step in the lead role. Todd's not there. You're still working with a team. You still might get some coaching, but what are some other things that they've developed with you?
I have grown in, I don't know if it actually is organization, but in the semblance of organization. Coming from a musician background, like I just went by feeling, and if it felt right, we'd go that way. And that's kind of a chaotic way to function all the time. And for me, I needed to learn how to be a little bit more disciplined, to make decisions ahead of time so I don't have to feel about them later. And so there's times where I keep track of stuff in a spreadsheet and it looks really organized, but it's me just trying to cope with, if I put it in a spreadsheet, I don't have to feel it. So
I feel like I've developed the spiritual gift of making charts to make up for my lack of organization. It's like I can make a I can make a document, but yeah, that's good. It does mitigate some of that emotional chaos that I can feel like I bring into my church.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Neighborhood Church. Like, what's the culture of your church? What are things that you celebrate in your church, and what are areas you see people growing in your church?
Yeah, we are. We're a little church in the woods, and It's really beautiful. The folks here are simple. There's a lot of physical need, and so folks are open to having spiritual conversations if they can sense that you care about them as a person. And so it's been interesting to see how very small acts of service have communicated a great deal of love and care to folks that often feel just neglected or like the world chewed them up and spit them out. And so it's been really cool. There's a growing downtown in Ocala, and Marion County is massive. Like, you can drive for 40 minutes across it and still not be through it. So when you say Ocala, you kind of have to be a little bit more regionally specific. And I think when we started in 2014 as Grace Church of Ocala, we really worked hard to reach the downtown. And after 4 years of that, we realized, like, the people who are actually going to drive to our facility, just because of where it's located in the county, are not the folks that are downtown. They won't cross towards the woods. But if we go towards the people in the woods, then we can probably be a bridge for ministry there. And so we stopped chasing the city folks and the lights and the sign and the smoke and all that. And we were like, well, let's be a church for our neighbors. Imagine that. And so as we talked through, as Todd left and I tried to figure out what our next steps were, praying through our mission and our vision and all this kind of stuff, we've always been about equipping disciples who make disciples. And that language shifted into inviting our neighbors to meet and follow Jesus, which I think is an expression of the same idea that we find in the Great Commission. But we realized that Grace Church wasn't really helping us do that mission, because there's 100 Grace churches in Ocala. And so we're like, well, let's change the name of the church. We got nothing to lose. And so we're like, well, what do we change it to? And prayed through that. That was our project at the beginning of 2020. I'm not a great visionary leader, but Todd was. He's got prophetic gifts. He can kind of see the steps to get to where he wants to go. I don't do any of that. So I was praying in 2020, like, God, what do you want us to do this year? And he was like, just pray for your neighbors and change the name. I was like, okay, I can do that. So we went out on the first Sunday of 2020 and covered our sign over with a sign that just said, we pray for you, and the website. And so we started praying for our neighbors and praying through, what name would help us invite our neighbors to meet and follow Jesus. And simple person out in the woods was like, hey, if we're inviting our neighbors, maybe we should just be called Neighborhood Church. And I was like, that's terrible. I hate it. No. And then we were working together in a team, and like, well, let's pray about it. We got to be spiritual. So he came back a week later, and everybody was like, nah, it's Neighborhood Church. We got to do Neighborhood Church. So it was not our first pick, not the fancy one we wanted, but as soon as we changed the name, Sebring and Lakeland also adopted our name too. So now we've got 3 neighborhood churches here in Florida. And if you would like to be a neighborhood church, then I'm happy to franchise out to Indiana too. Neighborhood Church in Leesburg.
Where do we sign up?
Yeah, right here. I've got a blank sheet of paper you can sign,
right.
Tim.
I do remember. So we asked Ben and Matt about the name change and rebranding, and I'm pretty sure they shared a story about someone showing up to the wrong church for a funeral because they were looking for a Grace Church. And in Sebring, there were so many Grace churches as well. But I love that concept of we're in the neighborhood, let's be a neighborhood church. And you, as you described your church too, you're saying we're a praying church. We're a church that works in teams. We're a church that reaches out. We're a church that serves. And you're the kind of leader who leads as a servant, not like from top down dictator, but you're listening to other people as you listen to God too. So I loved all those things surfacing as you shared that.
Well, that sounds like a really beautiful picture. I hope that we can live up to that, those ideals that you've portrayed for us, Tim.
Well, that's what your story said, so I'm drawing them out.
Hey, Michael, here at the seminary, we're in the midst of some big projects when it deals with preaching and the call of the preacher, the culture that a preacher is called to preach to. And so I'm curious, how many times a year do you preach in your church?
Oh, I have a spreadsheet and I could tell you a real number, but numbers don't stick in my head. So you ask me off the top, probably 42 to 45. I actually have a lot of folks that fill in for me and try to be out at least 1 week of the month. So.
And in light of that, what does sermon preparation look like for you? How do you develop your sermons, your study for sermons? What's your typical paradigm?
So we get together as a team, the folks that are leading the church in January usually, and have a preaching retreat. So we'll get together throughout the year. We'll take notes on ideas and stuff that we think is interesting, or observations of what's going on in the congregation that might need to be met. But then when we get together in January, we throw all those things on a big sheet of paper and just beg God to help us sort through what's priority right now. And then work together to put those priorities into the calendar. And so we walk out of that meeting with a spreadsheet that has a plan for the next, so every 12 months, we try to plan 18 months so that the next time we get together, we're not crunching to come up with something. We've got something there. It's just praying through, is this still the direction 12 months later that we want to be going?
And who's the leadership team here, or preaching team?
So that is all of Neighborhood Churches. So Ben is there, Pastor Matt's there, Pastor Orrin and Lakeland is there. I bring one of our elders, our pastors, Ryan Gagnon, and we just bring whoever it is that we feel like cares about what we communicate as a church and is willing to pray through that with us. So it's usually 2 to 3 days.
So all three of those locations then will have the similar preaching schedule or topic.
We do. That's how it's shaped out. That was not by design and planned that. So we did that for years in Ocala before Sebring. And then one year I just said, hey, Sebring, Lakeland, you guys want to come? And I fully expected they would come and make their own. And when we got together and started praying through the conversation, we were just like, we're trying to address the same kind of issues. We're all in the same state. Like, let's work from the same spreadsheet. So we have the ability to call an audible. If something comes up in Ocala, we need to change, then we do. But we work from kind of the same plan, although we're all able to adapt it as best needs, as it meets the needs of our congregations.
I think that's wise. I think it expands your resources. I think it makes creativity happen when you have more people in the room, not like 100 people in the room, but the right people in the room. It expands your creativity too. So that seems very wise.
One of the things that I didn't learn in seminary was the power of hearing. And so in that season where I was doing garden work and landscaping work 40 hours a week, and also prepping a sermon, listening to a chapter of the Bible on repeat as sermon prep for 2 or 3 hours at a time was just life-changing for me. I learned how to read the book in seminary, but there was something that happened in my preaching that unlocked when I gave space to hear it and to hear it over and over again. Because I think the text does something different in your ear than it can on the page. You just pick up a different rhythm to it, or over that amount of time, you notice different emphases. And so listening for my sermon prep has been life-changing, especially for the season that I was working bivocationally. And I as you think through like resources for preaching, like I would say, like listening to it, there's so many free audio Bibles out there. that are great. Like I'd say that's a huge thing that's benefited my preaching overall.
I feel like I've heard more men in ministry talking about, maybe this is just people in general, but talking about listening to the Bible as part of their daily practice or routine. And it is because you can ride a bike and listen to the Bible, or mow the lawn and listen to the Bible, or drive to work and listen to the Bible. But we know the scriptures originally had this audible feel to them. They were spoken and we heard them. And there's something about hearing the word that makes it come to life. So that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great practice.
Yeah, and not necessarily one I picked up in my formal training, but one that's benefited me a lot on the ground.
Let's talk here at the end about your relationship with the triune God, but we tend to focus on your relationship with Jesus. You've mentioned prayer a lot, and you've mentioned prayer at pivotal moments in your life, maybe transition points or whatnot. But what about the day-to-day, the week-to-week? How do you create space, Michael, to hear from Jesus? What does that look like specifically in the more day-to-day, week-to-week life for you?
I think I told you at one point, Tim, came across a book called The Common Rule that really reshaped how I interact with the Word and personally. So pastorally, being able to study and teach, that's a discipline. But as far as I was under the conviction that I do a whole lot of work for Jesus and not a whole lot of walking with him.
Yeah.
And so that book, The Common Rule, just gave two really simple things that really unlocked like my walk with Jesus, which was scripture before your phone. So before I check any notifications or anything, like have the discipline to not look at my phone until I have at least read a couple of verses. And I use a reader's Bible that has no chapters and verses in it. So I can't even, and I use a weird translation that I would never preach from, so that I'm not tempted to write a sermon while I'm trying to spend time with Jesus. So that's been a new desire for me, really, just in the last couple of years. Like I'll be the hypocrite in the room. Like I was a pastor for a long time before I ever wanted to read the Bible for myself, like as in personal devotions. So just in the last year or two, really having a thirst and a desire to read first thing in the morning, to meet with Jesus there while the coffee's on, like it's being brewed over there, whatever. But just sit and read. And I'll try to pay attention. If there's a verse or two or an idea that's really standing out to me, I keep some little squares of cardstock, like quarter sheets of cardstock next to where I sit to read. And if something stands out, I'll write that down, and then take it put it in my pocket and carry it with me, so that I have the opportunity, if I'll make space for it, to come back and revisit those moments with Jesus first thing.
Huh.
What were the ideas that seemed important to me when I was first waking up, now that I'm in the midst of the day and see what I have to face. Instead of begging for new revelation, how about I just go back and see if I've done the thing he gave me to do the first?
Michael, recently here on our campus at Grace College and Seminary, we had a leadership summit of sorts. We called it a network meeting. And the dean of our seminary shared some personal things about the dark night of the soul and burnout in ministry. The years of my pastoring, certainly there were seasons that, burnout, needed some recharging. And from our discussion and talk over the past few moments, you mentioned that you have a natural proclivity to have a melancholy personality. And so for you personally, how do you safeguard yourself from burnout, despair, or, negative mindsets in ministry?
I wish I had a great answer for you. I'm prone to them. The saving grace is the folks that God has put around me. My wife has saved my life more than I can count. She if there is like a category of like saints who get a halo on the earth, like I think she probably would qualify. But we've always, since, as hard as being in Ocala has been, one of the graces has been that God has always had a team of people that we've had high intimacy, like we trust one another and we can just talk straight with. And so Jesse, my wife, has been that for me. There are often times where Ryan, the other pastor here, has just been like, look, Mike, this is not okay. Like, I get that you're feeling this thing, but you can't stay here. And he's got a real gentle way of doing that. And so I think the thing that keeps me going is the Spirit of God applying the Word of God to my heart through the people of God, which hopefully is a microcosm of what we're doing on Sunday, but it happens to me pretty regular through the people that God's given me to walk with.
I love that. That actually ties into the common rule too. He talks about having these important people in our lives, and it wouldn't just be your wife; it'd be your kids, and they have a role in your spiritual formation as well. And I'm curious, like, how do you see God using your children to make you more like Jesus?
Oh, Tim, I'm afraid I already am sound a little bit crazy. Like I said, we did not plan to have a bunch of kids. And so I've had probably a bad attitude about being a dad for most of being a dad.
Sure.
I don't know, you get into Christian circles, you can mask it however you want. But like when I look back over where I have been as a dad, I've not had a great attitude about it. I got married because I like my wife, and the kids were a byproduct of me liking my wife. Like, I picked her, but I'm stuck with them. And so, like, that's not been great. However,
I think that's a book title. I married her, but I got stuck with them.
Yeah, it might be. However, as I'm watching these boys become men physically, I have been wounded by the fact that their experience of growing up in a home where dad really does want to be with mom. They love each other, and even if they're a little bit frustrated at me, they're committed to working together to provide for our needs. Like, that experience from my kids is gonna be unusual in their generation. And so, growing up Baptist, I think the common rule probably got me into a better appreciation of ritual and doing things and being formed by things as you do them, as opposed to simply just thinking yourself through things, which or believing yourself through things, which is how I grew up as a Southern Baptist. If you believe it, it's going to work for you. Sometimes we have to do things before we believe them. And I think come to a place where I feel like ritual actually does have a place in faith, and particularly in the lives of young boys becoming men. So as my oldest turned 12, was it 12?
You said he was 12.
He is 12, yeah. So as he was turning 12, so at 11, I realized he was really into Harry Potter. And so he was 11, and I realized the Harry Potter Hogwarts letter comes on your 12th birthday. And I thought, he already has this cultural thing that, we don't need to debate the witchcraft thing, but like, he already has this cultural marker that's not weird for him. So if I invited him into some kind of a ritual, some kind of a school of manhood on his 12th birthday, that would feel normal to him because he has this cultural marker. And so I studied and read all these books about initiation and rites of passage into manhood while he was 11, and tried to create some of these rituals to kick off on his 12th birthday. So created this false organization called the Primordial League of Men. I made a made a letterhead. I wrote out this initiation ritual. I had other guys come with me. Like, I wore a sword in the ceremony. There was a lot of mud involved. Like, it was a weird little moment on the lake, but we did that ceremony the month after his 12th birthday. And it was like, we did that ceremony, and the next weekend he stood up straighter. He looked his mom in the eye. Yes, ma'am. Like, it's not like his sin disappeared, but I could tell that having a group of men around him identify that he was moving into a new phase of life and calling him into something deeper was impactful to his psyche in ways that I don't think he knew. I don't think it's happening in his brain, but something's happened in his soul where I think he's really like grown leaps and bounds since we've done that. And so now figure out like, what is my responsibility to continue to shape and mold this young man who is in my house. So that's probably a much longer answer than you wanted.
Oh, but Trent and I have giant smiles on our faces. We're like, that is cool.
That is very cool. I think I may have seen that on YouTube. No, very, very cool. I'm very intentional with my son on many of those issues, and my son and I have spent many hours in the hunting blind discussing things. In fact, Tim, I taught my son the birds and the bees and the hunting blind as we were unpacking the crazy white-tailed deer during rut season. So great times with our sons for sure.
Yeah. Well, Michael, we always close out with this question. It's, what's something that you need to hear from Jesus during this season in your life?
I think if I knew what I needed, then I probably would be pretty self-confident. I've got no idea what I need. But I know that if I ask him to supply my need, something along the lines of, give us this day our daily bread. Like, I find that I have what I need.
Yeah. I was just thinking, as you were telling the story of your son and the ritual that you set up for him, that there was an opening scene in the Gospels where Jesus goes out to get baptized and he hears his father says, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased." And the father created this moment for his son there was a ritual to it, and there was announcement, and it sent him forward. And then I was thinking of how Jesus and the disciples, when he saw them, in addition to this repent and believe call, he says, "Come and follow me, and I will make you something." And I just feel like that would be something that Jesus says to you in the midst of this conversation. Come and follow, and I am making you something. So I'm not proposing to speak on behalf of Jesus for you, but I know he says that, and I feel like he's saying it to you.
Well, and I have grown more and more to trust the people that he's put in my life. When I think back about meeting you, Tim, we were in the process of writing membership class and discipleship pathway stuff for our church, and I was real frustrated because I felt like the language that was in my heart didn't exist in the wider church culture. And I don't know if I told you, like, I did not want to come to your breakout session.
Yeah.
I was frustrated and didn't want to do anything, but I brought my wife with me, and we hadn't really spent much time together, and she wanted to go to your breakout session. I was like, well, I'll just go sit with her, even though this is just going to be more of the same. And like, you had a language that, it wasn't identical to what God had been growing in me, but the ideas were the same. And so like, I have been more and more encouraged that the Lord actually speaks through his people, and like, it's okay, not in a mystical way of like new revelation and we should write this down, but like, the Spirit of God works through the people of God. And so I appreciate you sharing that, Tim, and I'll take note.
Great.
Michael, it's been a pleasure to spend the last few moments with you, to hear about you, your family, and your ministry. Thanks for being with us today, Michael.
I appreciate the invitation. I hope it's been helpful.
I've enjoyed it.
This is Dr. Trent Lambert from the Center for Thriving Leaders at Grace Theological Seminary, and I am joined with Pastor and Dr. Tim Sprinkle from Grace Leesburg Church. And thanks for listening to our conversation with Michael Lockstampfor.
The More of Us podcast recognizes that we are not alone. We lead best when we walk with others. Join us for more of these conversations by subscribing today. God bless.